Hey, class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are jumping in. Oh, sorry. Okay, there we go. It was being weird. So hold on, make sure I am still recording. Okay, sorry, weird start. Welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are moving into chapter 7, where we're going to cover the topic of social thinking and social influence. A lot of this will be familiar if you remember your chapter on social psychology from Intro Psych. Also, if you've taken a course on social psychology, a lot of times, psychology programs will offer that as a full course as well. So there will be some reoccurrent themes there that maybe you're familiar with, also kind of reframing it within the context of adjustment. So by the time you're done with the first section on forming impressions of others, basically, the idea of this idea of attribution theory. Hopefully that does sound familiar, or maybe not. That's okay. But after this section, you should be able to cite 5 sources of information people use to inform impressions, of others, explain the key differences between snap judgment and systematic judgments, define attributions, and describe 2 attribution based expectations, geez, I cannot talk today, that can distort observers' perceptions, recognize for important cognitive distortions and how they operate, and then finally identify some ways in which perceptions of others are efficient, selective, and consistent. So we think about, how do we form impressions of others? Sometimes we're talking about first impressions, like you hear that saying, like it's really important to make a good first impression. What we're really talking about is person perception. Basically, there's the process of how we form an impression of somebody else, whether we develop a favorable impression, like we like this person, an unfavorable impression, oh, I don't like this person. Maybe a job interview, it's the difference between, oh, I like this person and I want to hire them. I don't like this person, I'm gonna keep looking and hire somebody else. There are 5 key sources of information identified by social psychologists. We make perceptions based on appearance. Like, it's why a lot of times, your appearance, the first thing people see could literally be the first impression they make of you. Your verbal behavior, how well you speak, actions, your behaviors, your verbal behavior, and also your visual behavior, nonverbal messages, maybe your body language, things, we've talked about, I think, in previous chapters, and also situational cues, the context. Like, if you're acting a certain way in one context, maybe that makes sense, and they form a positive perception or impression. But if you're performing in a way that's unfamiliar to the context of the social situation, maybe it's unfavorable. So usually the impressions we make of each other, one person makes of another person, are based on some kind of combination of these 5 things. And the more information we have available, the more context we have, the better, the more, ideally, the more accurate the perception would be. But it's not always perfect. So, for example, maybe you're going to you move into a neighborhood, or you have neighbors who are moving in. Let's say this couple here on the left, they notice this couple on the right is new to the neighborhood. So you go to introduce yourself, present a really positive appearance, like you're coming with a smile on your face. Verbal behavior, maybe they're saying hello, welcome to the neighborhood. Actions, they bring fruit, they bring some kind of welcoming gift, really showing, hey, we like you, we want to like you, we want to get to know you. Nonverbal messages, I mean, that they're, maybe it's the body language, it's open rather than closed. And then the situational cues, this is appropriate to do, to greet somebody to a neighborhood, that is a very, appropriate thing. So maybe in this case, you're able to form a positive first impression, or a social perception. When we form impressions of others, we come to understand, make these decisions about people, we can rely on snap judgments, which are really quick decisions. Sometimes you might even call it like a gut feeling. Oh, I like this person. I really, first time I met them, I just felt really good about them. Or vice versa. Maybe you say, oh my gosh, I had this weird feeling about so and so, and right away I just kind of knew I was off about this person. And so it's relying on very small pieces of information. And if you've ever heard of Malcolm Gladwell, the author, he wrote a really fascinating book. I mean, it's probably over 10 years old by now, called Blink. And it's how we make snap judgments like this. How, for example, like art connoisseurs are able to, experts in art, especially when it comes to art appraisal, are able to make these snap judgments, especially when it comes to whether or not a piece of art is real or not. So there definitely is a time and place for making snap judgments. But then, those are sometimes we call these automatic processing. These are kind of shortcuts. Experts are more likely to kind of be able to make those kind of shortcut automatic processing in terms of decisions quicker, that maybe compared to somebody who is not an expert. But there's also a time and place for making systematic judgments where we really stop and evaluate all of the pieces of information when it comes to forming an impression. So ideally, maybe in a job setting, ideally, you would hope that your employer or potential employer isn't going to make their hiring decision based on a snap judgment. Like, oh, wow, this person, I really like this person. They're really nice, and therefore I'm going to hire them. Ideally, you would think, okay, they're going to take a more systematic approach where they take into consideration a number of factors. Your resume, that first impression maybe comes into it, but it's not the end all be all. Sometimes it's all about time and place, really. Sometimes we rely on those very systematic judgments. Others, maybe we might rely on a kind of a gut feeling. But either way, we're talking about, another way in which we form impressions is attributions. How do we explain the cause of a certain behavior, or how do we explain why something happened or why people behave a certain way? Typically speaking, we can make attributions of two types. There's internal attributions, where we attribute the cause of somebody's behavior, their, who they are, or to what they're doing is a reflection of who they are as an individual internally. It's based on things like their disposition, their traits, their abilities, or feelings internally. External attributions are where we attribute another person's behavior to situational or contextual factors. And typically, we rely on one of these two types in order to maybe explain our attributions of one person. Also, we might use these in terms of explaining our own. And when it comes to the research in social psychology and looking at attributions, we're most likely to make attributions about other people's behavior when they're acting in ways that are not expected or perhaps negatively, when they're personally relevant to us, and when we're suspicious about their motives. And when we have some kind of motivation to try to understand their motives, we're more likely to make attributions. So, and then, kind of falling in line with this, we also have perceiver expectations. When you're perceiving a certain behavior, that when we are observing other people's behaviors and forming a lens or forming an impression about them, we have certain expectations about how the world we think is supposed to work. And that can influence how we observe other people, how we look at the world through the lens by which we're shaped. Those perceiver expectations can bias, can distort, can, in significant ways, the way we form impressions of other people. So one of those is confirmation bias, where we might only seek out information that aligns with our worldview, and we discount information that goes counter to that worldview. Another example of a bias when it comes to perceiver expectations is the self-fulfilling prophecy. These are sort of conscious or even unconscious expectations about how we expect a person to act. Therefore, you treat them in a certain way. Like, I think about teachers. I'm a former high school teacher. I'm still a teacher, but I teach in higher ed now. But as a former high school teacher, you would sometimes hear about students positively or negatively before they came into your class. Like, maybe a teacher had this a student the year before, and they might say, oh, hey, you're going to really like this student. They're really well behaved. They ask a lot of good questions. They're engaged, things like that. Or you might get an example where a teacher goes, oh, be careful about this student. They're a troublemaker. And, essentially, if that kind of influence, those attributions, those impressions are formed before you even meet the student. And so in some cases, I try to ignore that information because maybe they acted that way in your class, but they're not going to do it in mine if I treat them differently. So, if you treat students a certain way and expect them to behave in a certain way, sometimes it happens. And I think we do that obviously in other settings too, not just in education. So, for example, when we here's an example kind of these biases kind of working together, or ways in which they could influence how we form impressions. You make an impression of another person. You think to yourself, you meet this new person, you think, oh, she's really funny. She told a lot of good jokes, had good stories, and your behavior based on that impression. Tell us a story about the time when, and you kind of prompt them to tell one of their funny stories. And that, of course, leads to laughter, kind of reinforces that behavior. and that corresponding behavior elicited from the other person. She then tells the humorous story as requested and tries to make witty comments. So it's kind of creating the settings by which this person gets to demonstrate they're funny, and also more opportunities to practice being funny. So kind of falls into that self-fulfilling prophecy as well. Another way in which we form impressions are through categorization. Like, we think, human beings, for better or worse, we think in terms of categories. We lump things that are similar into categories. So when that comes to people, when we think about people perception, we group people based on things like their nationality. Like, are you an American citizen? Are you not? Race, black, white, Asian, Hispanic or Latinx, I should say. Many different ways we might think about that: race, ethnicity, gender, male, female. We know that gender is more than just binary now. So those impressions are, the categories are certainly changing. We tend to look at people who are similar to us in terms of our categories as the in group. So maybe you're a student at OSU OKC, the school I teach at. Everybody else who goes to OSU OKC is part of that in group. You have that same social category. But anybody else who, let's say they go to another school, let's say they go to OCCC, Oklahoma City Community College, that would be the out group. And again, we do that on so many different levels. It could be, oh, I root for this sports team and that's my in group. And if you root for this team, you're the out group. But we also do that on a national level. Oh, I belong to this country, and the in group, and everybody's, who lives in this country, it's an out group. And same thing with race, ethnicity, and that can obviously create problems at a small scale. In group, out group in terms of sports teams, probably not a big deal. But if you think about it in terms of like race, nationality, gender, can have some really big consequences. So thinking about the consequences of categorizing the results that happen, people tend to have more negative attitudes when it comes to out-group members, especially when you're thinking about in-group versus out-group. People see out-group members as more alike than they really are. Basically, seeing like everybody who belongs to this group it's this idea of homogeneity. People, if you belong to this group, you all like the same things, you all act the same. Obviously that's lumping a lot of people into a box. The visibility of the out group members is heightened when they comprise of the minority in the crowd, when they're when it's kind of that majority minority kind of struggle. And again, this on any number of dimensions. People are even likely to see outgroup members as looking more like each other than they actually do. Sometimes you will hear this literally about different racial ethnic groups. They'll say, oh, it's hard for me to tell because all of these people look alike. Obviously, that is not a very wise thing to say. Clearly very biased, very, very stereotypical, maybe xenophobic, racist as well. But that is, kind of, again, this is where the consequences we see of those in-group, out-group biases. And that can lead to things like stereotypes, these held beliefs that a group of people all share this particular characteristic, and those things can be positive. They can be positive stereotypes. Like, there are stereotypes that, for example, certain ethnic groups are better at mathematics than others, and obviously, like, that's trying to take a positive stance, saying, oh, if you're a member of this group, you're really good at this, you're really good at math. But not every single person in that belongs to that group is good at math. What about the kid? What about the person or the kid or anybody who belongs to that group and who likes other things besides math? They like music, they like art, they like language whatever. You're basically seeing them through a lens which that doesn't even apply to them. So these stereotypes can be based on ethnicity, race, gender, religion, all kinds of factors. Can be based on physical appearance. Even there's stereotypes about people who are attractive. We tend to view them more positively. Attractive people are perceived more favorably than justified. Fact, if you factor in things like physical appearances. Another bias when it comes to attributions is called the fundamental attribution error. And this is a tendency when we are trying to explain another person's behavior, we're more likely to look at it through an internal attribution as opposed to an external situational. So, for example, like if somebody cuts you off in traffic, you're more likely to say, oh, that person is a jerk, they're a bad driver. but maybe there is some other situational factor, like they're running late, or maybe there was an emergency, a loved one just got taken to the hospital and they're driving more erratically. Doesn't necessarily excuse the behavior, but you probably would think differently if you understood the context. And obviously that's not always possible. So in order to form these attributions, there's sort of two steps that social psychologists have identified, both occurring simultaneously. You make the internal attribution, and then with some degree of cognitive effort, actually really, going above and beyond, you start to take into consideration the situation, the context. The second step in terms of cognitive effort is more difficult, is more effortful, and therefore we often skip it. It is cognitively easier to make an attribution based on some sort of personal characteristic rather than trying to understand the context of the situation. So here we go. And it's, so this type of thinking, the personal fundamental attribution error, is very much one of those automatic processes we looked at earlier. So you make an observation, a customer argues loudly with the bank teller. Let's say you're at the bank. Observer makes a personal attribution. Oh, wow, this person is very hostile. They're yelling at this bank employee. They're very hostile. Observer becomes aware of some situational factors. We add these together. Here's the customer say the bank has often made the same error. So now you understand more of the situation. Oh, maybe they're really not a hostile person after all. Maybe this has happened to this person multiple times. And you know what? If I were in their shoes too, I would probably be upset as well. So your entire narrative changes about that person. Another attribution, obviously one that is biased and potentially faulty, or I don't want to say potentially, is pretty faulty, is the defensive attribution. It's kind of, it's the idea, it's the just world hypothesis. And to some extent, it's the tendency where you blame the victims for their misfortune. Or blame the victim. It's the idea of blaming the victims so that they feel less likely to be victimized in a similar way. And it's sort of like, oh, something, you're poverty stricken, diagnosed with some kind of illness, whatever, probably should have been doing something else. It's, obviously it's not a very compassionate way to think about individuals. So in terms of person perception, when we think about how we think, cognitively speaking, this process is very efficient. We form impressions pretty quickly, sometimes automatically. We are sort of selective in terms of those impressions. We see what we expected to see, like in terms of those, confirmation bias, things like that. Consistency, first impressions do matter. We know from a lot of research that first impressions matter. And also sometimes cognitively speaking, people will tune out, will ignore, or subsequent information. So this is a phenomenon in psychology called the primacy effect. You're just more likely to remember things at the beginning than you are the middle and the end. Okay, so we talked about stereotypes. We talked about some of the problems that can develop from the quick way of thinking about things. Now we're going to kind of look at it even further, and how stereotypical thinking can lead to prejudice in terms of attitudes, developing attitudes of prejudice towards individuals. So we're going to, by the end of this section, you should be able to explain how old-fashioned and modern discrimination differ. And also some research looking into stereotypes, understand how authoritarianism and cognitive distortions can contribute to prejudice, clarify how intergroup competition and threats to social identity can foster prejudice, getting back into the in-group, out-group discussion we looked at previously, and describe the operation of strategies for reducing prejudice. We can fight prejudice. Prejudice is learned, it can be unlearned. Prejudice is just a negative attitude towards members of a certain group. And again, it can be based on race, ethnicity, it can be gender, political affiliation, whatever. But it's the idea, it's an attitude, which that attitude leads to discrimination. And this is overt behaviors where you are treating somebody differently, usually unfairly, because they belong to a certain group. Prejudice and discrimination go together, but that's not always the case. You do have people who hold prejudice attitudes who don't necessarily act upon them in an overt way. There are a lot of people who carry prejudice attitudes about any number of groups that just simply aren't even aware of it, and may only act on those in sort of unconscious ways. They're not necessarily overtly, going into somebody's yard like a Klansman or something and burning a cross. And they're, not everybody who is prejudiced does that, for example. It can look very differently, subtly. Prejudice and stereotypes can be triggered again without conscious awareness and can have consequences for behavior. Again, people can hold prejudice attitudes and stereotypes and not even be aware of it. Maybe you grew up in an environment where that's just commonplace. People, everybody thinks that way, and you might just think that's normal or not even be aware of that. It is a problem. So in terms of, here are some examples of prejudice and discrimination and how they are related terms, but not they're not the same. They're not mutually exclusive. So if discrimination is absent, same thing with prejudice, there's no relevant behavior here. However, if prejudice is present but discrimination is absent, a restaurant owner who is bigoted against Hispanics treats them fairly because she needs their business. She obviously, for whatever reason, as an attitude, doesn't like these people, but it's like, you know what, they bring me money, so I guess I'm not gonna be a jerk to them. Let's see, we have prejudice that is present, discrimination that is present. A professor who is hostile towards women grades his female students unfairly. So it's obvious these two things are in tandem with one another. Prejudice is absent. However, discrimination is present. An executive with favorable attitudes towards blacks doesn't hire them because he would get in trouble with his boss. So there's no prejudice attitudes necessarily present here, but the discriminatory behavior is happening. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, all of those things have changed and evolved. For a long period of the United States' history, it was very overt. For example, like slavery, Jim Crow laws, things like that. Very deliberately overt, in your face discrimination, laws on the books, intended to keep certain people down. Those aspects of discrimination have been on the decline. However, I understand that we do see discrimination. We do see overt discrimination. It is not dead, but it is not as nearly as present as it once was. It has evolved and changed into more of a modern form of discrimination. And this can be defined as when people privately harbor negative attitudes towards different minority groups, but express them only when they feel such views are justified or that it's safe to do, perhaps maybe around other people who hold those same views. But that does not mean just because there is this kind of new, more subtle, hidden discrimination, racism, prejudice, things like that, that does not mean these overt examples don't exist, because they clearly do. It is just changed. So, we think about, well, prejudice, racism, discrimination, these things exist. What are some of the causes? Well, authoritarianism, looking at, the way authoritarian personality, can be influential in terms of prejudice towards any group perceived to be different. We also see this characteristic more commonly kind of associated with right-wing authoritarianism, authoritarian submission, authoritarian aggressive, and conventionalism. I'm not trying to be political but it's just a lot of the same things we saw, for example, in the January 6th, the attacks on the Capitol. I'm not saying every single person there was sort of this right-wing authoritarian extremist, but there were a lot of people influenced by that, making these very sort of overt attempts to use this event to change things how they saw it, turn the government into a more authoritarian direction. Also, we see it's not just directly in terms of government, society, it's also in terms of how we think, which obviously can be influenced by society, cognitive distortions, expectations, the way we categorize people. That again kind of leads to this idea of in-group, out-group, which does more to divide than it does to keep us together. There are kind of tests and things like you can explore sort of implicit bias that you might have in terms of race, ethnicity. You also see, examples here from organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union that try to, directly attack these stereotypes and prejudice that individuals might have. Take a look at this example. It's in your textbook, and it talks about police stops and based on race, ethnicity, or how that influences how people are stopped and allowed to go about their normal everyday lives. So other causes: competition between groups, between resources. If one group perceives one to be a threat, conflict over scarce resources. If you think about war throughout the entire history of humanity, a lot of it comes down to scarce resources. This leads to things like prejudice against my group versus your group. Also threats to social identity. If the collective self-esteem of a group is threatened, this might lead to more in-group favoritism, and out-group denigration, cutting down or attacking, literally, physically, metaphorically, whatever, anyway, to kind of bolster your social identity and lower the social identity of the out-group. There's also stereotype threat, this idea that individuals, if they're presented with, kind of made aware of certain stereotypes when it comes to things like race, ethnicity, gender, whatever, individuals might act in certain ways, whether consciously or unconsciously, that evoke those particular stereotypes. Individuals, again, when they're targets of stereotypes, by others that characterize the group they belong to. Stereotype vulnerability can also undermine group members' performance on things like standardized tests, other measurements of academic achievement, success in courses, grades, things like that. How can we reduce prejudice? Prejudice is one of those things that can be learned. So cognitive strategies, effort is really needed. Cognitive effort is needed to sort of override those stereotypes, because again, that's really relying on those automatic processes. Allowing groups to have contact with one another helps, but it's not just contact alone. It is working on common goals, for example. Subordinate goals that require 2 or more groups to work together can also really help to reduce intergroup hostility. There's some really cool research, that you can read about. Oh my gosh, the name is eluding me right now, but it's the Robbers Cave experiment. Sorry. 2 different groups of Boy Scouts. One were the Rattlers, and I think one were the Jets or something like that. They were pit against each other at first and competed, and their tensions, were through the roof. They didn't like each other, but then they were brought back together later on to work on goals for improving the campground, and their attitudes about each other completely changed. They become friendly. So putting individuals and groups together from different groups to work together on common goals is a really research proven strategy for helping eliminate prejudice. So now we're going to flip the switch and talk about, how do we change someone's attitude? How can we persuade somebody? So you'll look at after this section, you should be able to describe various social factors and how they influence the persuasion process, discuss evidence of one-sided versus two-sided messages, identify some receiver factors that play a role in persuasion, and explain how the 2 cognitive routes to persuasion operate, central versus peripheral. So simply, persuasion is as a form of communication where you're intending to change somebody's attitude. And again, just a friendly reminder, attitude is your belief, your feelings about people, objects, ideas, things. And in order to be persuaded, there are certain elements. One, the source, like who is the one delivering the message? The receiver, who is receiving the message itself, the information that is being transmitted from source to receiver, and the channel is the medium. So, if you're at a political rally and somebody's standing on a microphone and talking to a crowd, that's the channel. It's in person. If somebody is, let's say, creating a video on social media and sharing it with their audience, that's a different channel. And obviously, all of these factors are going to be come into play in terms of whether somebody is persuaded or not. So you have source factors like the credibility, their expertise, their trustworthiness. Message factors, are they appealing more towards fear, more towards logic, emotion versus logic? Channel factors is in person, on TV, internet, social media, whatever. Receiver factors, are you receptive to new ideas? You have personality characteristics that are receptive to new ideas. Do you have pre-existing attitudes? All of these factors are brought into play when it comes to changing somebody's mind. So, and a lot of research has gone into this subject. So persuasion is more effective when we perceive the source to have high credibility. We deem them to be credible. They are experts. They are trustworthy. They're also likable. And this is sort of influence, not necessarily related to their expertise, but if we perceive the individual to be attractive and similar to us as the receiver of the message, we're more likely to like that individual. Messages also tend to be more effective and persuasive when they're two-sided. If the individual delivering the message, the source, is able to maybe bring up a point, bring up the counterpoint, and refute the counterpoint, it really shows, hey, this person understands the issue totally. It does increase credibility. Persuaders can use emotional appeals to shift people's attitudes, and also use positive feelings, have the person walk away feeling better about the situation. The receiver, all kinds of factors could be at play. Their mood, are they optimistic, pessimistic, happy, sad, whatever? Do they have a need for cognition, meaning they actively seek out opportunities to engage in effortful thinking? Was there any sort of forewarning? Were they able to kind of hear about the arguments ahead of time? Receivers of messages tend to be harder to persuade when the message content is incompatible with their existing beliefs, if it falls outside of their current worldview. Why are things persuasive? And this is getting into the elaboration likelihood model. Our thoughts about a persuasive message are most important to determining whether or not we will change our attitudes. And persuasive messages that are intended to change our attitudes can either happen through a peripheral route, which is not mindful. This is very much that automatic processing we talked about earlier in the beginning of the chapter, and central route, which is more mindful processing. So central route is persuasion based on the content, the logic of the message. You're carefully processing information about the message you're receiving. Peripheral route is based on things like persuasion, based on things like attractiveness, credibility, the emotions you feel, and does not require a lot of processing of information. So next time you watch a commercial for anything, any kind of product somebody's trying to sell you, try to pay attention. Are they using more of a central route? Like, are they telling you all of the awards that the new product has won and all of the things that it'll help you out with? Or is it more peripheral? Like they're showing you a celebrity using the product, the celebrity that you happen to like, which may or may not have anything to do with how good the product is. So, and sometimes companies will use both. They'll use both elements to persuade you. So messages, the research shows messages that are perceived through the central route tend to be more persuasive, more long lasting, and a better predictor of behavior. Because remember, attitude and behavior are related, but they're not always predictive. You can have an attitude about one thing and not necessarily act on it. Central route to override peripheral route, the receiver of the message must be motivated, kind of that need for cognition we talked about, to receive the message. And receivers must also be able to understand, to grasp it intellectually, contextually, understand what's going on. Okay, we're going to switch gears again and look at the power of social pressure, the power of the situation. So you should be able to summarize what Ash discovered about conformity, distinguish between normative and informational influences of conformity. And then lastly, we're going to look at Milgram's research on obedience and explain how to resist demands from an authority figure, resist obedience. So conformity, we all conform to some extent. Like we have to conform to traffic laws, for example. Like if we don't conform to the rules of society to some extent, society just doesn't work. When we yield to real and imagined social pressure, to some extent, that is what keeps society functioning at a certain level. But there obviously is such thing as too much conformity. And this is what Solomon Asch, a researcher in 1955, was interested in doing. He designed a study to demonstrate that people conform more easily to wrong answers given by people in a mock perception test. And he also found that conformity increased to a point as group size increased up to about 7 members. And then after that, that's kind of the line. Anything less than anything more than that, it's going to change the result. So what I mean by is essentially Ash brought in, you'd walk into a laboratory setting in a room, and there would already be 5, 6, 7 people seated at a table. And you would be told, hey, go ahead and have a seat here at the last chair that's open. And you're told, hey, we're going to do a test on your visual acuity. We want to see if you can distinguish between the standard line here and the matching, which line does that standard line match with down here. And then, everyone ahead of you gives their answer, and you're last, you get to give your answer out. Everybody's giving their answer out loud. And, you look at it and see, okay, yeah, I can see it's number 2, but everybody before you, for some reason, says, no, it's 3. They're intentionally giving the wrong answer. You don't know that. You think they're, in on the experiment just like you, but turns out they're Confederates. They're in on it the whole time. And these individuals giving the wrong answer, I want to say if the group size is somewhere between like 5 and 7, if individuals given the wrong answer, the real participant in the research is also likely to conform like 75%, like 3 out of 4 times. And this is obviously replicated many times, changing circumstances in some of these experiments, but overall the group group influence can be very powerful in terms of conformity. And the result, the research kind of exploring this further, conformity is when we yield to imagined or social pressure. Compliance is when that's public behavior, even though maybe your private beliefs haven't changed, even though in your head you're maybe saying, I know this is the wrong answer, but I'm gonna give the wrong I'm gonna go ahead and give the wrong answer anyways. So why do we conform? There's normative reasons why. Maybe we want to avoid negative social consequences. Like, for example, if you're with your friends and you're trying to decide what movie to go to, and all your friends want to see, the new Star Wars movie, and you don't really want to see it, but you say, okay, I want to go. I'll go with you. I'll conform and go with you folks because, if I say no, then maybe that means I don't get to go to the movies tonight. You all go without me. Informational influence is when we're trying to behave in ways that are we look to others, we look for other people how to act, like this is a novel situation, I'm not sure how to act, so please show me how to act in this case. And so kind of thinking about that, the pressure to conform can be both normative and informational. And this can even lead to an additional phenomenon known as the bystander effect, where we're less likely to perceive somebody as needing help the more people that are around. So let's say you're out walking around outside, maybe you're going for like a walk in your neighborhood, and you see somebody falling on the ground, you've got your cell phone. If it's just you're probably going to, ask them if they're okay, maybe try to get them something or call, 911 or whatever. But let's say if you same situation, now there are 10 other people walking around and you all see it. Each one of you is less likely to do something because you're probably all thinking, oh, well, so-and-so is going to do it. It's not really it's not my responsibility because 5 other people saw this too. And they could have called as well. So how do we resist conformity? Pay more attention to social forces that are operating around you. Read the room, understand that there are larger forces at play. Identify someone in the group whose views match your own. Try to find an ally. Bring along a friend with similar views if you know that you're going to be confronted with social pressure. Having an ally can reduce the incidence of conformity pretty dramatically. And taking conformity kind of another step forward is obedience, where we comply when people give us direct commands. Usually this is somebody we consider to be in a form of authority. Maybe it's a police officer, maybe it's a principal at school, maybe it's your professor in class. But Stanley Milgram in 1963, through a series of studies, looked at how people's tendency to obey is pretty strong, especially if they are asked by an authority figure, even when it comes to harming another person. So here is kind of setting up, what's happening here. Stanley Milgram brought individuals into a laboratory setting, kind of like what's shown here. They were told, hey, you're going to do a teacher-learner experiment where you're going to teach a series of word associations to another person, but that person is going to be in another room, hooked up to a device like this, and you're going to be communicating over a two-way, intercom radio system where you can hear each other. You can't see each other, but you can hear each other. And you are also told that every single time this person gets the answer wrong, that you are to push a button that delivers a small, not harmful, not lethal electrical shock. So, and it starts off at 15. So you can see the meter says slight shock. Maybe it's kind of like if you touch static electricity, it might surprise you, but obviously not going to hurt you. But each time they get an answer wrong, you are to move up the voltage to higher and higher and higher. And what Milgram wanted to know was how many people would be willing to go all the way to the final number. And each time the voltage got higher and higher, the individual, the learner, the one who was getting the answers wrong, would say things like, oh my gosh, get me out of here. This is hurting. I have a heart problem. This is really starting to affect me. But and even if, so what happened was sometimes the teacher in the experiment would hear things like this and say, oh, hey, I need to stop. Like, this person is in trouble. They're hurting. I need to, can we please discontinue? And the researcher in the room with you in the laboratory coat, kind of looks like this fellow here, would say simply, you must continue. Please continue. They were there to represent the authority figure in this case. And so what they found is obedience, based on this research, is strongest when the demands increase gradually. So moving up by 15, 30, 45 volts incrementally. Others take responsibility for your action. That was what many times the authority figure in the experiment would say is, I'm responsible for the action. You just keep pushing the buttons. I'm responsible. If we are motivated to meet the authority figure's expectations, if you don't have a lot of time to think. So human behavior, when we think about human behavior, is determined by the power of the situation than the character, because most of the people in this experiment were pretty normal individuals. They experimented using men, using women, using college graduates, using non-college graduates, and the results are mostly the same. About 6 out of 10 or 65% of subjects were willing to administer the highest voltage of electricity. Now, granted, nobody really got shocked. The person on the other side of the wall was a Confederate who pretended to be shocked, but it didn't actually really happen. But what it did reveal is that people who claim to be ethical and unwilling to hurt another person, if you put them in the wrong situation, that can easily change. Okay, here's an application of this. How do we see through compliance tactics? So after this section, you should describe 2 compliance strategies based on principles of consistency, discuss how the principles of reciprocity and scarcity can be used for purposes of social influence. So the consistency principle says, once people agree to something, they will tend to stick with it. Like once somebody's made their mind, they've been persuaded, they're more likely to stick with it. And thinking about this, you can use socially a phenomenon called the foot in the door technique, is where if you can get somebody to agree to a small request, you're more likely to get them to a larger request later on. That's why it's get your foot in the door, prevent them from shutting the door, even if it's something small, like, hey, will you just read a pamphlet about my candidate? I just want you to read this pamphlet. Okay, cool. You read the pamphlet. Oh, would you consider maybe making a donation? I know you just read the pamphlet and you found like 5 things you like about candidate X. Will you consider voting? This also is related to the lowball technique. If you can get someone to commit to an attractive position before its hidden costs are revealed, they're more likely to, keep going with it. Oh, you agreed to buy the car, but, turns out, yeah, you got to buy the warranty and all these other things too, but you love the car, right? The reciprocity principle also exploits the tendency for people to think they should pay back in kind what they receive from others. So this is kind of related to the door in the face phenomenon. If you make that large request initially and you get turned down, in order to increase the chances somebody will maybe agree, okay, you said no to me putting up the big sign in your front yard, but would you at least consider wearing the button? I know you don't want the giant yard, but help me out and just wear the button tonight at the rally. That's what I mean by is if they might deny the big request, but that kind of sets you up for the little request. So here's the foot in the door. Here's both of these at play. The small request first. Would you donate some old clothes from one of our charity programs? If they say yes, cool. Would you now consider donating $50? You've already helped our organization out once. Why not help again? Reverse of that, door in the face, large request first. Would you volunteer to run a weekly program for our youth group? They say no. Well, how about you just donate $50 instead? Save yourself the time, help the organization out, just donate $50. We'll call it good. And another tactic or another way we think about compliance and persuasion is the scarcity principle, People believe if they think something is scarce, therefore it must be good, therefore they're more likely to buy it. And when people kind of, the reactance to that is when people want what they can't have. The simple act of scarcity kind of does something psychologically, whether it's economics or any other thing we're talking about. So you see this in advertisement and economics all the time. Limited supply available for a limited time only. Order while supplies last. Time is running out. Whether it's time that's scarce, whether it's the material that's scarce, something about that. The psychological aspect of thinking about scarcity really is motivating to people. So that's going to be it for chapter 7. We're almost to the halfway point in this course. We'll pick back up on chapter 8. Let me know if you have any questions either on Canvas or drop them in the comment box, and I'll get to those as soon as possible. All right, thanks. Take care. Bye.